So, as anyone who knows my work at all, really, over the last few decades knows, I've spent considerable time focusing on the social construction of mental illness. I've done this in poetry, I've done this as a performance artist, I've done this across a large amount of work, sculptural, environmental, sometimes sort of radically performative, radical in the sense of failing to recognize clear distinctions between the boundaries between aestheticization and lived experience, meaning my work is sometimes difficult to recognize as art. Radical in the sense of participating in a number of different positionalities within the discourse that constructs subjectivities as either sane or insane, mad, or socially acceptable, possessed, dispossessed, that constructs subjectivities as socially productive or socially unproductive. In any case, I want to read a piece that I've never actually read before. It was up on the web for a period of perhaps 5 or 6 years, and it's a piece that deals with a particular location on Roosevelt Island called the Octagon, which was once, when the island was referred to as Blackwell's Island, was the architectural site of the asylum or mental institution that provided a place away, from the civilized domain of New York City to isolate individuals that were performatively inscribed with this label, madness. At the time, madness was the conventional designation rather than mental illness. Roosevelt Island is a location just about in the middle of the East River between Manhattan and Long Island City. On one side, you can look across and see some of the high rises in Manhattan, and on the other, across to Long Island, you see Socrates Park, one of my favorite sculpture gardens, and one of my favorite places to perform when I lived in Astoria, Queens. Doing pieces relating to the construction of mental illness and madness, Roosevelt Island became one of my favorite places to do work, and all different kinds of work. And a lot of that work is documented in a piece, a book length or chapbook length, I suppose, work of poetry called Gardens and Walls, because of the extensive gardens on Roosevelt Island at that time, both community gardens and public gardens. So two different kinds of gardens, and walls, because of the different types of incarceration that has a history there on Roosevelt Island. So what became the motivational impetus for writing this piece was the fact that the Octagon had been some of the old buildings have been demolished and removed, but the Octagon, the mental asylum, was converted into a luxury apartment building where people housing. And it occurred to me that this was sort of reliving a whole history of violence done against individuals that were, like I said, performatively authorized by this word madness into positions of isolation, suppression, torment, captivity. Sometimes they became objects of amusement for the sane. One instance of madhouses in England describes that you could actually, rent like tools to prod and poke the mad, and for a small fee, you could view the insane and sort of torment them like the way that one would torment an animal in the zoo, which I think if isn't equally wrong, is certainly wrong enough, right? But anyway, I thought that the real madness was in the act of converting this place of horror into a luxury apartment building in the first place. I analogously thought that who would want to buy a room in what was once Auschwitz, and that analogy may seem strong and hyperbolized, but I think after a reading of the poem, which is, I should point out, all of the events in the poem are drawn from historical realities. I didn't make anything up. I engaged some of these historical figures in dialogue and conversation because that's what I do. But these are real stories, and some of the stories are embellished. And I imagine the details where the details are left out of the record, but these are real individuals who existed and lived these lives, and none of it is completely fictional. So that being said, we'll see how far we get through the poem. And in the background, I have images that are currently they're available on the web. It's luxury apartments on Roosevelt Island. I suppose you can if you have the resources. Obviously the intention of the images in the background are to give some alternative, context to the reading that I'm going to perform today. Oh, and I was going to say, Minnehanek, which is the title of the first section of the piece, the overall title of the piece is 7 Dry Stone Markings in a Garden for Mary Grady. And then the first section is called Minnehanek. Minnehanek is the original Algonquin word for the island, Roosevelt Island, and it means, can be translated as, it's nice to be here. So I'll go ahead and begin. Minnehanek. It's nice to be here. Nice to come home, if one has a home. Imbibe the scent of rose petal, rosemary, and pear blossom in Mama's English garden, in the perfume of her blouse, if she has no such garden. In imagination alone, if one is without such a mother. It's nice to return to such a place where one feels welcome, read one's name, scratched into the bark of the familiar birch tree. Nice to feel safe if one has been deeply hurt or threatened with great harm. Good to be alive, if condemned to death. To see sky when emerging from dark pit, from black well, yet still. A Minnehanek of the meanings trapped within such words, of the voices silenced. Beneath or within them, how to speak of such things. how, aika. It's nice to be here. Nice not to have been born 100 years earlier. Nice not to have known such darkness. Nice not to have become one of the forgotten, the silenced voices. It's nice not to have taken up residence with the silent dead, the unspeaking, and the unspoken. And where would you be then, whispers Sarah in my ear? Where would you be in such a cell perched over the river? One subway stop from Lexington Avenue, and 3 from Rockefeller Center, I laughed back at her. And with a panoramic view of the East Side skyline, she smiles in return. You are a ghost, Sarah. Yes, of course. And what exactly are you? Minahanak, Sarah, it's good to see you. Good to have you here. 2. Break it down, create a plan, ask for help. Yet still, Sarah, how to begin and once begun, however to end, to put such a word to rest. Minahanak, it's nice to be here. Perhaps there is no rest for such a word, nor for those of us born to such a world, in which Minahanak was always only the figure of a dream. So how then are we to come to a point of rest, to conclude, end, or even pause in dignity and repose, without mouth still hanging agape? To believe at least in the idea or just the dream of home and love? Is it rest that you really want, or retribution from wrong? You know that conclusion is incompatible with truth. No recollection reflected honesty. In the false mirror of tranquility, no still water, no lapses without further depth of unknowing, no stone too mute to reveal the meaning of stone. Then how to utter the indecipherable words of such stones? The visions, the tongues and voices, the blackened eyes of the Aika. How? The receiving of hollow from the black well of echoes, from the wall, from the tremble of wall, and fingers which tremble against the flesh of wall, from the many faces turned to the wall, and the too many more turned away from it. To the flower one speaks in the language of flowers. To the shadow one speaks in the language of shadows. To the world one speaks in the language of the world. To the wall one speaks in the language of walls, of gray gneiss, blood, vein, granite, silver slate, and blue shale. But how to commence the lamentations in the language of blue-gray stone? How to restore such a language to its quarry, dismantle and ruin the octagonal sanctuary, the refuge of lies? How to speak in the language of quarried stone, the blue-gray vision of our destruction? By speaking of what remains hidden within such a language, of the blindness of language itself and the wandering of the blind words beyond the limits of the cities, their capitals, their familiar homelands and homes, by speaking of the destruction of first city, first world, first Eden, first home, by recording the loss of first language and first hope, by recording the memory of first loss in blue-gray marking stone. Displacements. Displaced men, displaced women, displaced children. And how to lament the loss of the city of of the Sprach, of the language in which one could speak of such loss. How to reclaim Bethlehem within the thrum of Bedlam, palace of noise and confusion, endless days of endless nights of cesspooled death. Quote, symbol of man's inhumanity to man, end of quote. named for a star which heralds humanity's redemption from sin. That's a lot to ask, little brother, but I'm afraid my answers will only lead you on to more questions. Let me ask you this. What were those simple instructions you used to advise the hurt ones about the impossible? Break it down, create a plan, ask for help. 3. So then ask yourself how the first question begins. I don't know, Sarah. The questioning begins with the question of how, aika, with the shape, the form, the way that we cannot speak. How? No, that's only the question raised in your reaction to the ad. The first question begins before feelings, before empathy and anger, before you as a subject of need, a need or desire for expression, before you congeal into the embodiment of that expression. Reread to me what is written there in the ad. What has called you into being as the subject of this need? Where would you be if you lived in a luxury apartment perched over the river, 1 subway stop from Lexington Avenue and 3 from Rockefeller Center, with a panoramic view of the East Side skyline? So where would you be, Bruce? There on Roosevelt Island, at the site of the old insane asylum where I spoke with the ghosts and felt a great awakening. Oh, I'm afraid you'll lose them there. What exactly is a ghost? A spirit which inhabits a place across the decay of time. A spirit which awakens the dreamer from the sleep of forgetting. A spirit that breaks the silence, speaks from the place. Speaks from the place where speech is no longer possible. So tell the story from the place of the awakening, not from inside the dream. Tell them that in December of 1999, you would be there on Roosevelt Island within the communion of its ghosts, receiving what is sacred in the holy place of our destruction. The touch of God, tremble flow of great universe, and flower petal and iridescent flicker of dewdrop. And in March of 1894, wouldn't you be there again and again, looking forward into back? Speak of March 25th and where you would have been on the same day that Coxey began his great army's march upon Washington. This was our last night on Blackwell's Island, prior to the great transfer to Metropolitan on wards, movement full of hope and promise, wondering at the stillness upon the black water, pale blue moon sparkling in the obsidian mirror of this thin stretch of sea, channel of dark passage, tidal strait of swirling eddies, between the false promises of asymmetrical dreams. And tell of how the dream shattered along with the mirror, how upon Ward's Island confusion was king and corruption his consort. Yes, I remember now, all was noise and squalor, how the rooms were without light or heat, the floors stagnant pools of shallow water, of how grief-stricken even new moon now refused to show her face, either in day or in night sky. And tell them where you would have been in the summer of 1837. There again, cutting blocks of building stone from the Grady quarry for what would remain of Alexander Jackson Davis' original Tuscan stylization of Betham's great panoptic plan. Tell them where you were in November of 1865, on that evening in which Dr. Parsons, in completing his annual report of the asylum's conditions, remarked upon the grace of the great octagon, quote, which has a symmetry, a beauty, and a grandeur even that are to be admired. End of quote. There still again, in an even smaller room on the 4th floor, sick unto death with typhus from the filthy contamination of the ward, tell them that the rash covering your ribs, chest, and arms had begun to bleed, Tell them your fever, untreated, refused to break, that in the stupor before failure you could not think, to think could no longer speak. In protestation or complaint could only tremble and drool. Familiar performances, they say, in the zoological gardens of the mad, and do not fail. And do not fail again as before to record the fact that your name, that my name did not appear in Parsons, nor in any of the other physicians' accounts of that year. Good. Now tell them how, in the 2 years prior, you broke ground for the garden, planted pumpkins and cabbages in the black soil. Yes, I remember that now. I remember that you carried shale for the new seawalls and dry stacked stone hedges heroically. Yes, heroically, as you say, and defiantly against the ruthless insistence of institution and time. 4. How Sarah Ryan became a woman made entirely of stone. But that's not all of it. That's not enough. Nothing ever is, and everything is always already way too much. So then, what about you, Sarah? Where is your place in this story? I have none. I have never had a place in this world. My story begins and ends with the tales of ghosts, like those you have spoken of, like yourself. Tell me about those ghosts, then. What I remember is this. I was my mother's last child. After me, she couldn't have another. She said it seemed Irish yarrow would not blossom in this new world. And the rest? They had other children before you? My 2 older brothers died in Angora before I was born. Mother left for America while I was still within her. Father came with us, himself ill. Perhaps still sicker from grief than hunger, I was born between death and destitution in passage across the Atlantic. 5 days before our ship arrived in New Orleans, I don't remember much about the early times, except of always being hungry and unwell. Mama said those born to an Rochelle were bound to live a hard and unhappy life, if we were lucky enough to live at all. At 16 years, I found work in the garden district as a housemaid and made enough to buy fresh bread and cheese. Then I fell in love with a boy named Frankie. He worked as a laborer on the channels that year. I found the courage to believe perhaps Mama was wrong about this bad life. I was happy for the first time and wanted to remain that way for the rest of what might have been. When was this? I'm not quite certain. Around 1864. 2 years later, I was with child and Frankie left when he heard of it. Back to Ireland, they said, because things couldn't be much worse there, and at least it was his home. I lost my position as well when I began to show, so no more fresh bread, and that was the end of happiness. And the child? A little girl, still more unhappiness. She died in childbirth, I think because I had grown too weak to care for her, become too tired to be her mother. Either this, or she had already returned to Ireland with her father. Perhaps she wanted no part in this world of ghosts. And what of the rest of your life, Sarah? There's not much more that really matters. What do the asylum records say? Not much. Nothing really. Quote, Sarah Ryan, female, white, between 35 and 40 years of age, native of Ireland, committed July 17, 1882. This woman is a raving maniac who can give no account of herself. She is naked in her cell. The occipital bone overlaps the parietals nearly half an inch. This woman died on the... It's blank there, Sarah. I'm sorry. at 3 a.m. The autopsy made 9 hours after death by Dr. Archinard, coroner, and myself revealed an atrophy of all the organs as well as the muscles. The pia mater especially, and the whole brain was congested. What during life was taken for an overlapping of the occipital bone was a thickening of that bone, externally at its protuberance. Except at the occipital protuberance, the bones are much thinner than usual, being translucent in their greater proportion. The pupils were normal. "Oh, I remember this," interjects Sarah. "The doctors had laid me out on a table. I could hear all of them talking very excitedly. Once I had passed away, they were all suddenly very much interested in me. Before that, it was difficult even to get a glass of water. I remember it very clearly. They were so eager to have a look at me, cut me open, and see exactly what had gone so terribly wrong, with the bones and the brain and all of that. And all of that, as it were, of course, they still hadn't a clue why any of this had happened." "Why did it happen, Sarah?" "Well, I don't know exactly. I don't know myself. But I do know that after Grace died, my body began to turn to stone, slowly at first with a stiffening and slowness, and then more and more, till it became too difficult to speak. And then it started to touch my mind as well. I suppose what they said about me being naked must be true, because I couldn't put clothes on myself, and there was no one there to do it for me. I'm not sure what they mean by raving maniac, though. I never intended to be unpleasant to anyone, but sometimes I'd ask for something, ask for a blanket or food or water, and not much would come out but noise, because, as I said, my body had turned almost completely to stone." "Is that all it says, then?" "Yes, that's the complete record." 5. Nor is there a garden nearby. And the other places, those intertwined so subtly both with Sarah's life and with mine, how to speak of these? How many of our dead must be raised again? How to speak of the Naranturm, of the insidious needlepoint with its lightning rod, whose scholars continue to inform us, quote, its use has not been clarified, end of quote, as if such truth-seekings were akin to the melting of butter. How to remember the Hanwell Asylum, quote, temples sacred to benevolence, monument and memorial to the philanthropy of its times, end of quote. As expressed in the humanitarian practice of rehabilitation through the involuntary performance of profit-bearing and interred slave labor, enforced by the ingenious design of its principal edifice, yet another central octagonal panopticon tower of neoclassical design, including a basement and 2 stories with walls argus-eyed and semicircular windows framed in a graceful brickwork of arches, which recall the Lion Gate of Mycenae. That such buildings, or so many of them, still stand upright today, whether in ruins or restored as monuments, committing new, bizarre, and hideous offenses in the service of institution and capital, while the voices of those who lived and died within their shadows remain silenced, buried, forgotten. Aika, how to speak of this? Aika. How to write of this, how to write after this. How to restore such voices to the world of the living, to memory, remembrance, and memorial. How to disinter them from the shallow graves and remorseless clinical epithets of the record keepers, the spotted and soiled histories belched out so carelessly and coldly, most closely kept secrets. How to speak of Mary Grady, resident of that same asylum in which Sarah Ryan turned completely to stone. Mary Grady, for whom Only the doctor's report bears witness, quote, speaks of her children who are in the garden, whereas they are not present, nor is there a garden nearby. 6. Those who have come before us. Although so many of these monuments stand upright today, what exactly have we memorialized? What is it that we've remembered, and what have we continued to need to erase, to hide, bury, and forget? In 1997, at approximately the same time that the city of New York began plans for the restoration of the Octagon Tower on Roosevelt Island, Bethlehem Royal Hospital, the oldest surviving institution for the mentally ill, commenced preparing a celebration of its history in order to commemorate the occasion of its 750th anniversary. Those plans seemed no more vile, nor less, no more incomprehensibly offensive, no more ludicrous, no more outrageous, no more completely mad than had those to transform the site of Blackwell's asylum by the city planners and capitalist investors of New York City. Only a small handful of individuals even seemed to notice that there was something terribly, profoundly wrong with the very thought of such a celebration. And yet we know this, that for 1 penny it was possible to view the displayed within their performance of madness in the theater of Bedlam, the freak show of Bethlehem, and that admission was free on the first Tuesday of each month. Quote, quote, visitors were permitted to bring long sticks with which to poke and enrage the inmates. In 1814 alone, there were 96,000 such visits. End of quote. How can we speak of such visitors, of such visits, such visitations, or within such thoughts, remain silent without remembering again and again in this circle of drift, the smell of blood on our hands, the taste of filth in our mouths? Where is our own feral Ubu, Saint Pete, Shaughnessy, and a few others from Mad Nation, Army of the Mad, were sensible enough to realize, where others were not, that plans such as these were no less than idols to monstrosity, memorials not against the history of horror, but completely blind to it. These were rituals and sanctifications of forgetting. And so it was Shaughnessy of the gray-blue quarry stones, Loch Nessie, Pete Shaughnessy, Loco Malstra, swan dragon of our weir, who led us 7 times by 7 round the walls of the garden of inhumane terror and shadow, until only those who refused to look could not fail to see it had fallen beneath the rage of the mad. Shaughnessy, dead at 40 in the year 2002, only 2 years my senior, suicided by society's need to deny the reality of desire, to end desperation. And this must be said, whether we raise Shaughnessy's ghost to say it in his own voice, or whether we decry it in our own. Shaughnessy died because he could not live and bear the thought that horrors like these could be passed off with a smile and a toast, that his life ended because the actions of sane men told him that he had no place in their world, their history, that he had no claim to protest, no case in the court of reclamation. And Shaughnessy, with his broad smile and keen wit, would have laughed, understood the black humor of the truth regarding our humanity. that once having invested in those luxury apartments, having made that great move from Manhattan to Roosevelt Island, even the most well-intentioned middle-class fool would never be able to admit to himself that his life there, his view of the wonderful skyline, his access to the major subway lines, his 2-acre Garden of Eden, that all of these mean less than nothing in comparison to the offense created by the use of that octagon tower and its history. 7. The Garden for Mary Grady. A garden composed entirely of light, since we have no resources for seed and soil. Since the earth is not ours, sun is uncertain, water costly beyond our means, and the rain refuses to fall from either clear or cloudy sky. A spectrum of the possibilities of light, uncompromising in certainty, undaunted in purpose, that our beloved should not pass into night, that those we have touched should not wither or turn away, that starlight would speak in its darkness in the language of light when lamplight, candlelight, and language itself fails. Iridescent, ultraviolet, limpid, opalescent, penumbral, dappled, prismatic, polarized, lucid, piercing, radiant, aglow, lustral, incandescent, crepuscular, luminous, vivid, translucent, aureate. Garden, from the German Gart, enclosure, as the eye encloses, discloses the seeing, but not the seen. This light through glass serving bowl, carved with undulate leaves, blossoming flowers, yellowish, golden, amber, brown, muted sparkle, and in it, through it, the grape cluster of dull orange purples, edged like crescent moon slivers in illumination of crystal light, upon apples smooth and striated skin, upon shimmering waxy lemons pitted and porous, rind, coruscating, splendid, effulgent, efflorescent, effluent, effusive. In place of flower bed or furrow, this diagonal shaft of morning light through kitchen window disclosed, gardened by the Brownian movement, swirl an eddy of thin, evaporating smoke from a cigarette, and the thicker, slower, still uneven billows of a pipe, or memory. Memories of light sparkling upon the water beneath the soft and furious bridges of memory, of ripple and vortex in the midst of lighthouse, garden, hospital, and asylum. Shadows against which to measure and discern the brilliance of light, light unseen in light, set against light, child's garden light, garden of sand light, mud light, of water and the flow of light, and shadow meandering upon the surface of water, light, games of gathering, light from light, since light passing into, against, and through things, so should a garden of light. Enclosure embracing the beyond, toward and within, into, against, and through, lantern, lamp, lighthouse, beacon. And such light, Mary, to have met you there, in such a garden of childhood and memory, not so much as we are today, remembering Mother's promised English rose garden, but as what we once might have been, as we might still long or dream or see within such light to be or to become.